Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Murray Griffin from communications consultancy Earthed. Around the world, national governments and sometimes state governments operate emissions trading schemes that apply to businesses that emit large amounts of dangerous greenhouse gas. Australia's program is called the Safeguard Mechanism, and it applies to just over 200 factories, mines and fossil fuel power stations. The scheme actually started in 2016, but for its first 7 years, the former Conservative coalition government made it so weak that it did pretty much nothing. It wasn't until 2023 that the new federal Labor government gave it a major overhaul and some teeth, or at least some baby teeth. And last month, we learned how companies responded in the first year after those changes. First up today, I'm chatting to three safeguard experts, Thomas Hodgson and Grace Tully, both of consultancy Anthesis, and Dr Franziska Curran, an academic and consultant. They have plenty of interesting things to say, but I guess one of my favourite quotes is from Thomas, who describes the safeguard as a minimum viable product, but a good one, nevertheless. After that, I chat with Mark Tilley, Asia Pacific editor with online climate change and nature news services Carbon Pulse and Biodiversity Pulse. And we're chatting about what Australia's stunning federal election result, which delivered a landslide victory for Labor, means for climate change and nature policy. Mark points out that Australia is now in the midst of an unprecedented period of policy certainty. Before we go into the chat, while most of it doesn't require much or any prior knowledge about the safeguard, there's 3 points that it's handy to know. First point, the safeguard is all about imposing emissions caps, which is unsurprising. But surprisingly, those caps are called baselines. And let's face it, a baseline in every other context is the opposite of a cap. Okay, so that's point one. The safeguard is about emissions caps, which are called emissions baselines. Second point, the safeguard now requires big emitters to cut their emissions by an average of 4.9% a year. They can comply solely by cutting on-site emissions, which is the best option. But on-site reductions aren't always possible to the extent required, so big emitters can also use Australia's two types of carbon credits, which are known as Australian Carbon Credit Units and Safeguard Mechanism credits. Those credits represent cuts to greenhouse gas emissions that have been achieved elsewhere in the economy. Schemes that have this flexibility to partly use credits are called schemes that require companies to reduce net emissions, which is why you'll hear a reference in the chat to netting off actual site emissions when they are still too high with carbon credits. The third point is about protecting competitiveness. Some Australian companies under the safeguard are competing against international businesses that are based in countries where they aren't required to cut emissions. To make sure that the Australian businesses aren't unfairly disadvantaged, the safeguard allows some facilities to have a baseline that reduces by much less than 4.9% a year. These are called trade-exposed baseline adjusted facilities, or TEBA facilities. The concept of TEBAs is a good idea, but as you'll hear, Grace has uncovered what looks like some overly generous benefits for these TEBA facilities. Now, let's press play on the chat. Thomas, Grace, and Franziska, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Franziska, when we were planning this episode, I loved that you described yourself as still deeply obsessed with the safeguard. But you're also now teaching or about to teach a master's course on net zero for business. And I was just wondering, is there a lot of interest in the course and what sort of people are signing up for it?
Oh, that's right, Murray. I'm pretty excited about it. So it's one of the units in the Masters of Sustainable Energy or the Sustainable Energy program at UQ, which has been going on for a few years now. and teaches students a whole range of things around, the sustainable energy technologies, energy and development, energy transition issues and finance. And so it's quite a diverse cohort, including people with technical and non-technical or legal and policy backgrounds. So that'll start in a few months' time. And I'm really excited to be having meaningful discussions with people about how businesses have to be and are a part of the transition, especially with all the recent changes in legislation and disclosures.
And it's great to see courses like that on offer to the business sector now and to see the interest in them. Grace, you're an engineer and a senior consultant on decarbonisation and the energy transition with Anthesis. Welcome, and could I ask you, what's been a career highlight for you so far?
Thanks, Murray. It's a good question. There's many, but I think I would have to say our work with Orica on their decarbonisation projects at the Kooragang Island and Yarwun facilities has definitely been a highlight. Early on this year, they hit the awesome milestone of abating 1 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, the majority of which is from a reduction in N2O emissions at their Kooragang Island site, which is fantastic. They've been super interesting projects and really impactful.
I can imagine they would be absolutely amazing projects to work on. I like a big bit of engineering, and they would have been quite incredible. So congratulations on that. Thomas, you've been engaged with the safeguard for a very long time. The federal election result has confirmed that the safeguard will continue. How important is that in terms of the nation's overall emissions reduction efforts?
Yeah, I've been involved now for really since the scheme's inception, so coming up to 10 years, and prior to that on the carbon pricing mechanism. So quite some time in this space. Really important, I think, is the answer. Really, really important. And that's because the election result now means that the safeguard mechanism has survived a federal election and will now have at least 3 more years to embed itself and become a normal part of the landscape for Australian business to negotiate and consider, as they plan their transition to a net zero, but also as they seek to become more profitable and to more sustainable as they move forward. So a really, really important outcome.
An important outcome, and I think we can call it, let's face it, it's 6 years of certainty for the safeguard, because it would be pretty impossible, I think, for the opposition to come back in just 3 years from where it's sitting now. But we'll get to the issue of whether the safeguard is delivering enough abatement shortly. But firstly, in its first year, did it deliver what it was supposed to do? Did it do what it said it would do on the tin? And maybe, Grace, you'd like to take that one first up.
Yeah, it's a hard question, isn't it? Because I think year one easing in with only a 4.9% decline rate. I say only, of course, it's far more substantial than we've ever had before. But there's sort of you'd almost say a bit of a waiting period before we start to see the scheme exactly how it's going to look and what it's going to deliver. But ultimately, covered emissions did reduce 2.7 million tonnes. It's not an enormous amount, but it is a reduction, which is great. But of course, lots of facilities purchasing carbon credits and using those to net off exceedances, and at the same time, lots of facilities being issued safeguard mechanism credits that maybe didn't necessarily align with actual on-site decarbonisation, and instead were sort of a function of the way that baselines are calculated under the reformed mechanism. I guess at a high level, you'd say a reduction in total emissions is good. We do have a finite carbon budget, and we need to be reducing our emissions every year. So from that standpoint, you'd say a reasonably successful year one, but definitely a space to be paying close attention to, in the years moving forward.
Okay, and Thomas and Franziska, did you want to add anything there about the whether the scheme delivered in its first year?
I think certainly yes, but coming from a slightly different perspective, in that, to my mind, the revised safeguard mechanism promised climate action without the outrage, without the pushback, and ultimately, therefore, more sustainable long-term action. And I think you'd have to say, based on the recent election and the fact that it wasn't something that really came up at all, so therefore, you could conclude that it hadn't really generated particularly large amounts of outrage compared to, for example, the original carbon pricing mechanism, that it was very effective in achieving that outcome. And yeah.
So a sort of quiet achiever.
Yeah, exactly
status. Yeah.
I think one of the reasons it didn't generate the outrage, as Thomas has put it, is that it is net emissions, not absolute emissions. And so obviously the use of carbon credits is accepted and actually integral to the scheme. So, if the point of the safeguard mechanism is to reduce absolute emissions, well then that's a different question. But the point was to reduce net emissions to support Australia to reach its national climate target. So it has reduced net emissions. It has seen the sacrifice of, I think, around 7 million ACCUs were cancelled. Australian carbon credit units were cancelled. So that is a massive investment in climate finance. But in terms of absolute emissions, sort of like Grace said, we did see a little reduction, but it wasn't around the 4.9% of absolute emissions that we keep hearing at 4.9%.
Yeah, that's a good point. But in terms of the on-site abatement that did come through, were there particular facilities that delivered most of the abatement, or was it spread fairly wide?
Well, I think, like Grace said, it's day one. It's the first year, and I think there wasn't a lot of a run-up period for people to get prepared in that first year. So I think the reliance on offsets this year is higher. So I think that decrease, I think a lot of it could be noise as well. It's hard to say which facilities are carrying their weight and which ones aren't, because intensities can fluctuate. And we know that the safeguard mechanism baselines are set on intensity. So you're measured against your emission intensity. But in total, I think the absolute reduction, so the on-site reductions, was, if you look at the actual reported emissions for all facilities, it decreased by 1.4%, which is still something. And that's absolute emissions. So it's the start for the first year, and hopefully can ramp up from there.
Thomas and Grace, you were both out in the field helping facilities to chase down both absolute emissions reduction opportunities as well as offset work out their offsets strategies. What were your impressions in terms of how facilities were coping with year one, or coped with year one?
Good question. I mean, fundamentally, they're still coming to terms with it, and it took quite a long time for it to cascade through businesses, from those looking outwards and those who worked in the environmental space within a business, to those who, the CFOs and those who controlled the finance. So that's been a long transition, which has taken most of the first year to play out, ultimately concluding at the end of the year when either CFOs received a pleasant surprise because they earned SMCs, so safeguard mechanism credits, or a bit of a shock because they're in liability. But you can say at the end of that first year now, it's really gone through the full gamut of the business cycle, and there is a much deeper understanding. And now with the enhanced confidence, it's around moving forward. In terms of what have businesses done about it, certainly a lot of our clients have, run their mind across, what decarbonization opportunities do I have? And what is the current price of carbon, which is in the realm of $35 a ton. Oscillates, but that's about where it is today. And in order to make a rational decision to decarbonize, firstly, you needed to overcome the risk that this scheme would be dramatically curtailed, which was a large risk up until quite recently with the election. But you also needed to have a standalone business case that supported the investment necessary to do that decarbonisation at a circa cost of carbon about $35 a tonne. And the unfortunate thing is there is not a huge number of projects that are viable at that price point. Some in the coal mine space are viable, but they're long lead times, high risk, and high complexity. So they're not going to be the kind of thing you can invest in straight away. But I would say certainly because of the safeguard, conversations have started to occur in, for example, the resources sector that wouldn't have occurred in the absence of the safeguard mechanism. And that's the first step.
Okay. Grace?
Yeah, I think I agree that maybe the outcome was a bit of a shock to some sites. And largely, I'm guessing that's just a function of the fact that the legislation wasn't finalised until during the year itself. So there wasn't really any ability to prepare for FY24, or at least a very small ability to prepare, especially for sites that had no plan in place already. So unless there was sort of an off-the-shelf solution that could have been installed very quickly, and I'd say that none of our clients really had access to anything like that for year one, it almost was a take the hits in year one, but use it as a basis to start to get buy-in from within the company for how a plan could be put in place to manage at least up until FY30, and then, looking from there onwards as we move into the reform kind of planning years in FY26, 27.
Fair enough. Yes, they certainly didn't have much lead time. I want to come back, Thomas, to something that you mentioned, which was the ACCU price, because, this might be a dumb question, but all these companies are supposed to be using a shadow price of carbon, or a lot of them are. And in many cases, that shadow price would be significantly higher than $35. So, what's going on? Like, why aren't these companies making decisions on using a carbon price that's much higher than $35?
That's a really good question. And I think there's two kind of primary parts. The first part is that shadow carbon prices can be much higher than $35 a tonne, but they can also be at or below that price point too. There's a lot of variation. So that's the first part. Second part is that just because you have a shadow carbon price doesn't mean you'll use it effectively. Sometimes and quite often it sits on the shelf ticking a box to say that you have one and that you might write about it in your annual sustainability report, but you don't actually use it to make business decisions. And the CFO doesn't actually consider it when they're making an investment decision. I think that's going to change and will change very quickly now that the safeguard's here to stay for quite some time. But hitherto, it hasn't necessarily always been used to its full effect. And I think that's a shame.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I must say, when you say that, it just makes me think, well, that to me sounds like a litigation risk, because if you're saying as a company, oh yeah, we have a shadow price of carbon and it's blah, or, and then it's actually ignored. Yeah, I wouldn't like to be defending that approach in a courtroom. Now, the safeguard is due for review the year after next, but there's a much more significant event coming up for the safeguard before then, because in the next several months, Australia has to make its new climate change pledge and share it with the world. Let's say that the government sets a target of reducing emissions to 75% below 2005 levels by 2035, or maybe slightly lower, 70% below 2005 levels. A target in that range is quite possible. What would that mean for safeguard covered facilities? Thomas, do you want to take that one first up?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be quite an increase in ambition, I think, is the ultimate answer. So currently we have a 4.9% reduction rate. That's through to 2030, and there's a reduced decline rate after 2030 through to 2050. So if we needed to hit a higher NDC, then we'd need to see increased ambition in the safeguard mechanism. If we make the assumption that the safeguard mechanism and the Australian industrial sector is going to carry its equal weight of the emissions reduction challenge, if it could be the case that we actually lean more heavily on our industrial sector to decarbonise in order to take the pressure off other areas that are harder to abate, including agriculture. But in the circumstance that we assume that the industrial sector is going to carry its even weight, and that the increased ambition translates from around FY28, we're going to see an increase from about 4.9% per year through to about 7% per year through to 2035 to hit that 75% reduction target.
That's quite a significant increase.
So quite a significant increase. And my personal sense is that we probably won't go that ambitious. And that's because going back to my original thought about the safeguard and the revised safeguard and what is it intended to do. And I think part of what it's intended to do is to deliver decarbonisation without the outrage. If you start leaning towards 75% by 2035, you're going to start generating outrage and pushback. And as we saw earlier, that could undermine the viability of the entire scheme. An NDC of 75% by 2035, I think is warranted by the science and the scale of the challenge, certainly. But it does start to become relatively ambitious, and that will potentially start generating pushback to the scheme like we saw with earlier iterations of carbon pricing in Australia.
Okay, and so is there a way around it? Like, how do you be as ambitious as the science requires without generating outrage?
That's a great question. And it's ultimately one for our politicians to solve.
Yes.
But, for what it's worth, we're fundamentally limited in terms of how fast we can decarbonize by the market's willingness to pay, and to a large extent that's a global market's willingness to pay, not just the Australian market's willingness to pay, but it's also the available technology. And if we start pushing our industry to decarbonize faster than technology allows and faster than the global willingness to pay, then we're going to encounter challenges. And it could be the case that a slightly less ambitious target hits that sweet spot around achieving rapid decarbonization at the spot where technology is at and enables, as well as where the global market for low carbon products is and can support investment.
Yeah, I guess possibly. Does anybody else want to add anything there in terms of how decisions about the Australia's next international climate pledge could influence the safeguard? Grace, did you want to weigh in? Or?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think Thomas's point is exactly right, that there are probably political limits. And I think those are maybe exacerbated a little bit in the current political climate in Australia. We saw throughout the election, there's been a lot of discussion from the coalition that a net zero target is imposing an unfair cost on the Australian people. And I think that just adds even more weight to Thomas's point that if the two sides of politics pull away from each other and have fundamentally different views about what mitigation looks like, then the realistic outcome of that is that the safeguard mechanism could come under significant scrutiny, and it's hard to know if that is going to really enable Labor to push it further and push towards a more ambitious emissions reduction target. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer, I'd say.
Yeah, and Franziska.
Yeah, I keep thinking about what is the world going to be like in 5 and 10 years, and how will the global climate ambition and transition accelerate or evolve? And it's hard to say, but I do feel there's a balancing of outrage, a balancing of industry's outrage against climate outrage and investor pressure and consumer pressure to accelerate action as well. So yeah, a tricky one to answer.
Those are interesting responses. I guess a bit depressing, maybe, because we need an emissions. We do need an emissions reduction target. That's significantly more ambitious, and the Climate Change Authority's initial advice, I think, was something in the order of 70% at least. So, yeah, somehow there is that balancing act between that sort of goal and designing the supporting policy in a way that actually can deliver it without major problems. And
I can just add, Murray, that so many of the safeguard mechanism covered facilities do have net zero 2050 targets. So we've got the endpoint clear. And that 2035 interim, I think a huge part of that will still come down to net emissions and the use of land-based or other offsets that do reduce Australia's national inventory but might not address the safeguard mechanism cohort's absolute emissions. So, I think there is momentum, even if political will can fluctuate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to come back to the point that you raised, Thomas, because I'm just going to say it. I want a science-based target and a national target, and my understanding is that that means we're looking at about 70% at least by 2035. But taking your point about trying to do it in a way that's workable, because you do have to bring everybody along, including businesses. I mean, we have the incentive side can be made larger. We already have various incentive schemes or streams of funding for various safeguard categories or projects. Do you envisage that as an avenue to both deal with that problem that you're concerned about, which is blowback, but while also being as ambitious as we need to be? Can we tighten regulation, but also be much more generous in terms of the incentives we offer?
So, I guess I should probably caveat that position around 70-75 being too ambitious. With that position being too ambitious, where the government doesn't provide significantly more support to decarbonise.
Yes.
And there are schemes in place currently, Powering the Regions Fund and others. But in practice, certainly in my experience, they're just very difficult. They're cumbersome, burdensome. Oftentimes you need projects that are shovel-ready, that the government might come in and support. But in order to get a project shovel-ready, you've got to have gone through a significant amount of investment already, and you would have only done that because you already had a really compelling project. So if you've got a more marginal project that could work, then right now it's really hard to get government funding to support you to just explore an idea with no real prospect necessarily that it could work. So I think if the government wants to increase ambition, and as you say, the science demands that it does, it also must support companies to decarbonise more than just the existing settings, I think.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Good point. That makes sense. Does anybody else want to weigh in there? Grace, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and maybe the counter to this is also that there is complementary policy. I think it will be really interesting to see how the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, mandatory financial disclosures kind of tie in with the safeguard mechanism as we start to see safeguard facilities having to report on their climate risk, and that includes transition risk, which for many of them is going to be the cost of compliance with the scheme. I think that could play an interesting role here as well in potentially sort of countering a bit of pushback that is focused on the safeguard mechanism, because instead, or maybe in parallel with that, these companies are going to potentially be getting more pushback from their shareholders and from the market more broadly. So I think maybe we're past the worst of the pushback against the legislation itself that's forcing decarbonisation, because so many of these facilities, as Franziska mentioned earlier, they have voluntary targets to decarbonise. Many of them appear to see the need that they do need to decarbonise going forward. And And policy like the ASRS is sort of supporting that change in narrative a little bit. And, I think there's always room to enhance it. I really struggle with the idea that we focus on decarbonisation as a cost on its own in isolation, and it's a cost against a baseline of business as usual operations. But really, I think we should be comparing it to the cost of inaction, right? If we're not reducing our emissions in line with science, what is going to be the cost of climate change to us in Australia and globally? It will be immense. So if we don't decarbonise now, what sort of costs are we pushing down the line for ourselves? And that's a pretty dangerous comparison to not be making, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the government says that the safeguard applies to just over 200 facilities that each emit more than 100,000 tonnes of carbon pollution each year. And of course, that's, that is the case. There's about 217 of them. But I'm just wondering to what extent that is true in practice. I mean, are there facilities for which the safeguard is basically irrelevant to their decision making and they're sort of covered by it in name only? And do these facilities have any common characteristics?
Unless you're a very marginal operation with, you're not making particularly much profit, it's likely that the safeguard is currently a relatively negligible component of your overall profit and loss, and will remain like that for some time to come. Obviously it's more significant with those businesses that are not particularly profitable, but also those same businesses don't have the same financial resources to respond to the scheme. But what it does do is provide a clear signal, I would say an outsized signal, the change needs to be taken, and that this thing that currently represents a relatively minor, for the most part, contribution to the profit and loss statement will in the future become much more significant. And so the time is now for action.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in there? Grace?
Yeah, I agree with that completely, that the cost of a 4.9% reduction in your baseline is not necessarily going to cost a lot for many facilities, but in 3-4 years' time, that increases a lot. And I guess, as we said earlier, that FY24 there wasn't a lot of time for preparation. This case is really that it's time to start investing in technologies and really driving an uptick in the technology readiness level of decarb opportunities for that 4-5 year time period when the cost of the scheme becomes more expensive.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
And what I noticed as well in the data that was published from the first year of the scheme is there are some facilities that are generating significant numbers of safeguard mechanism credits. So I think there was nearly 20 that generated more than 20% of their baseline in safeguard credits, which basically, if they continue with this intensity of production in the future, they might not have to pay any compliance under the scheme for years. There were some that generated 50% of their baseline. So I think people will be looking carefully next year as to whether that trend continues, because while the generation of safeguard mechanism credits does mean a reduction in overall intensity, it could also mean people doing less than they could, facilities doing less than they could, and contributing to climate action.
The point of a market-based scheme and fundamentally a cap and trade scheme, which is what we have with the safeguard, with some caveats, is that those with the opportunity to decarbonize at the lowest marginal cost, with the greatest access to finance and so forth, will be the ones that decarbonize the most quickly and reduce the cost of the economy overall to decarbonize. So if there are facilities that have lots of potential to decarbonize at a really low marginal cost and can generate SMCs and therefore reduce the cost of decarbonisation for the Australian economy more broadly, I think that's excellent and that should continue.
So as we've talked about, the safeguard currently applies to just over 200 of Australia's top emitters, but a lot of people say it should apply to a significantly wider pool of emitters. And I'm going to ask each of you what you think about that, starting with you, Grace. Should the safeguard be expanded?
In an ideal world, Murray, I think it would cover everyone. I think the safeguard mechanism, if it was a general carbon pricing scheme covering whole of economy, would enable and encourage lowest cost decarbonisation to be occurring right now as we speak. But with the current design of the scheme, it is, there's a reasonable amount of work that needs to go into the calculation of a baseline and meeting the data requirements every year. And if that was dropped to 25,000 tonnes, that would be 250 new facilities overall, with Scope 1 emissions equal to about 3% of national emissions. So the emissions contribution of lowering the threshold is not significant. Would it put more pressure on those facilities to reduce their emissions? You would say absolutely, compared to having a no stick mechanism in place. But those are facilities that in general are probably primed to participate in the Australian Carbon Credit Union scheme, the ACU scheme that we discussed before, and perhaps how the current safeguard mechanism is designed is that the price of carbon credits is going to increase as demand increases, and maybe that's where these facilities look to participate more broadly, is decarbonising and generating credits.
Okay, thanks for that. And Franziska?
I couldn't say it better than Grace. I totally agree. The return on investment for extra effort for emission reduction isn't huge when you expand.
Thomas?
Yeah, I think some really good points. I had experience, I guess, in the original carbon price, which did apply down to 25,000 tonnes. And really my takeaway from that time was that those small facilities were oftentimes controlled by small to medium business that was not well equipped to respond to the price signal. Less mature sort of frameworks to measure their emissions and have a clear pathway to abate those emissions. So going back to that key thing around what do we want the safeguard to do, we want it to generate, in my view, as much abatement as we can with the least amount of outrage. And I think we're going to really deviate away from that by including small facilities which don't have a huge amount of ability to implement decarbonisation because of their scale and their maturity.
Yeah.
But are likely to generate a significant amount of outrage because they're likely to be employers of lots of people who don't have a clear path to decarbonise. So you're penalising organisations that can't well respond. But going back to Grace's point, if they did happen to have a clear path to decarbonisation, for example, transitioning from coal to gas or coal directly to renewable energy sources for heat, for example, then they can participate in the emissions reduction fund or safeguard scheme. And we've seen many examples of that at landfills, at meatworks, all across the economy. We've seen examples of that and have seen examples of that for a number of years. As the price of carbon goes up and up and up, and as technology improves and things like electrified transport becomes more mature, you'd expect those small businesses to increasingly seek out these kinds of opportunities because it's a way of decarbonising and de-risking their business, but also increasing the profitability of their business.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Look, thanks for those comments. A bit of a consensus there. And I'm pretty much of the same view. I am basically a hard no on expanding the safeguard. And it's not, well, it's partly for policy reasons. It's partly also because I think if you did expand it, the opposition and the Murdoch press would immediately stir up a great big new tax campaign and use it to say Labor can't be trusted. And we've been down that path before and it's very destructive. And there'd be plenty of medium-sized emitters who'd be out there willing to jump on the bandwagon with them. But I mean, storytelling, difficulties by themselves are not a reason for making policy choices. But in this case, I just think there's a better way to do it, and I think that better way is to get state EPAs more involved, because they're much better placed to both educate medium-sized emitters and regulate their emissions down by using their licensing regimes, and they can still then generate ACCUs. So in my view, that's where the focus should be. So I'm partly using an optics argument there, and a storytelling argument, difficult stories to sell argument, which I'm a bit reluctant to use, because I'm not really convinced by we can't have a target of 70 or 75% for 2035. I take the point that might create difficulties for some, and you might need to shift targets within subsectors. But certainly on expanding the safeguard, my attitude is no way.
And you got to remember too, Murray, that because of the design of the scheme, even if there isn't a 75% NDC by 2035, the fact that there are safeguard mechanism credits to be earned means that anyone who wants to do more than their allocated share, or even go all the way to zero, can do that and have quite a compelling financial case for doing so because of the design of the scheme.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. And I mean, we are going down a bit of a side path, but I'd point out that New South Wales has a 2035 target of a 70% reduction, and Queensland, although it's probably slated for the chopping block, currently has a target of a 75% emissions reduction. So that clearly has ramifications for businesses operating. I mean, I can't remember what Victoria's is. I think it might be in the same league. So it's not as if that we, a national target in that ballpark would be a whole big new thing for these companies, because they're operating in jurisdictions, many of which already have that target, that sort of target.
That's a really interesting point as well when you consider the national target versus state targets, and the fact that the safeguard mechanism is a national scheme that allows the use of credits that could be generated anywhere in Australia. So we also should look at the numbers of absolute and net emissions by state for these facilities as they contribute to state targets.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. It's
like
if you're buying all your credits from one state, but heavy emissions are happening in another, well, the second state's not going to achieve its objectives.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Okay, I am going to read out a criticism of the safeguard that somebody made recently, and it's actually someone who works in the oil and gas industry. And so here we go. And this is the quote. "The only certainty the safeguard mechanism provides is the certainty that you can buy cheap as chips offsets instead of having to actually reduce emissions. Emitters love the scheme, voters don't understand it, politicians get to pretend they're doing something. What's not to love? When regulation is not meeting its objectives in other areas, we change it, but when it comes to emissions reductions, it's too often a case of, well, what we have is better than nothing, and it's better than the ScoMo government. The offsets are simply too cheap to drive actual emissions reductions efforts." That's the end of the quote, and it's pretty scathing. I'm kind of amazed
scathing, isn't it?
that it's come from the oil and gas sector, or from somebody within it. So who wants to jump in with a response to that? Maybe. Thomas, do you want to kick off?
I mean, fundamentally, that I think it's fair to say that the credits are not, cheap as chips. I think if you were to go, what is a benchmark for a cheap as chips offset? It's probably some of the lower tier offsets that are available through the voluntary markets. And there is, credits are at a couple of dollars per ton. And if you want to go cheaper still, it's what happened before there was a safeguard mechanism, and you could pollute for free. So you could put all the carbon you wanted into the atmosphere at $0. That's cheap as chips.
Yes.
A voluntary credit at a few dollars a ton is still cheap as chips. An ACCU at $35 a tonne is, in my opinion, not cheap as chips. And what it does represent is a growing unfunded liability into the future for those businesses who are unable to decarbonize. And that's, I think that's the essence of the safeguard mechanism. It's no longer free to pollute, and the cost to pollute is going to grow and grow and grow. The question is, how do you react?
Yes. Good point. Okay. Grace?
Yeah, I agree with everything Thomas has said there. I guess if we were to play devil's advocate and read into this comment a little bit, I think there is merit in the criticism of the safeguard mechanism, in that it's not really a cap and trade scheme because credits can be created outside of the scheme to offset liability within the scheme, which means there is a bit of an imbalance. There could be as many players outside the scheme as they want to can participate in that ACCU scheme, generate credits, and those could be purchased by safeguard entities, and there could be no real decarbonisation. And it does mean that the supply-demand question doesn't necessarily encourage a cost of abatement that reflects the true cost of abatement for safeguard entities, which, because of their emissions profiles being so high and the nature of them generally being heavy industry, abatement is more challenging for them than it is for a lot of smaller fossil fuel users. So I think there is merit in that criticism. Does it mean that the scheme is not doing anything? I certainly disagree.
Yeah. Okay. And Franziska?
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. I'm not sure the emitters who had to surrender 7 million ACCUs would agree that. I don't think all of them would agree that they love this scheme. And if they love it now, I'm not sure that they'll love it in 5 years' time. And I'm sure ones that had to surrender 50% of their baseline aren't very happy with the scheme. I do agree that it's hard to understand. Voters don't understand it. I agree that we have a difficult time translating it because of all the nuances and the carve-outs. So that's true as well. But I think it does come back to the net versus absolute emission discussion again, that people are allowed to or able to use offsets instead of actually reducing emissions. Like we've discussed, some facilities have that easy. And perhaps if that were to change, or if perhaps part of that was more restrictive, then it would have more teeth and force a bit more of absolute emission reductions that will be harder and perhaps more costly.
Okay. All right. Well, let's apply the blowtorch to the safeguard a bit more, because there's a report that came out this month on cutting methane emissions in New South Wales and Queensland coal mines. And as we know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And this report said that there are now plenty of opportunities to cut methane emissions in these mines at a cost of under $30 per tonne of greenhouse gas emitted. But it says the safeguard won't make that happen. And that's because their analysis suggests that coal companies in those two states would only need to pay an average of between 8 cents and 65 cents for every tonne of coal produced until 2050 to meet their safeguard obligations using carbon credits, either Australian carbon credit units or safeguard mechanism credits. So, why would they do anything given that low cost other than increase coal production rather than investing some more money in these available abatement costs? Now, I think you've probably all had a look at this report, so I'd be interested in your views. Maybe Franziska, do you want to kick off there?
I'd be okay with Thomas and Grace, who work more in the coal sector these days, kicking off.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, Grace, did you want to kick off there?
I actually think maybe Thomas might be best to start this one, Murray. It's most deeply in his wheelhouse.
Thomas, last man standing. So
go, Thomas.
Yeah.
I really like working as a climate change and decarbonisation professional with the coal industry, because there's just so much potential at such a low marginal cost. And so, and I contrast it with my experience working, for example, in the gold mining sector, and there, really the only kind of path to decarbonize outside of using renewables for your power generation is to use alternative fuels and new energy sources in your trucking fleet, which they're already trying to do as quickly as possible, but they're very inhibited by the lack of technology and the slow rollout of some of those capacities. The coal sector, however, huge potential to abate emissions. And one of the ones that's most exciting is what they call ventilation air methane, which is the methane coming out of an underground coal mine that is mixed with a large amount of air to reduce its concentration well below the flammability limit, and that's done for safety reasons. So you might have a vent coming out of a coal mine at many hundreds of cubic meters a second, but with a methane concentration of less than 1%. And that's really difficult to do much with. It's too low to burn, far too low to burn in a flare. It is very, very difficult to burn, even utilizing some of the emerging technologies for abatement. It can be done, but it's very difficult. So thermal oxidation. So basically where you heat that stream of gas up to circa 1,000 degrees and let it auto-ignite and abate. It can be done, and there's a lot of work going into exploring how to do that. And then you've also got catalytic abatement, which is something you can utilize to reduce that methane to CO2, but it's also unproven and challenging. The marginal cost of doing this is quite low, and that's why industries are already exploring it quite actively, even at current carbon prices, because it's quite a profitable addition to their business. And, what profit-seeking business out there doesn't pursue a profitable opportunity? Really any well-run business would. And I think in large terms, abating methane from the coal mining sector in particular is seen as a profitable potential opportunity and something that is being considered. However, it's not as easy as just that. So, particularly when you're looking at thermal abatement, you're looking at heating up a stream of gas coming out of a very high-risk underground environment with hundreds of workers to 1,000 degrees and burning it. And that's something that you necessarily need to be really careful about, thoughtful about, to ensure that safety remains throughout the primary focus.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Look, point taken on that one, and that's an interesting reflection based on first-hand knowledge. Let's move on then. A couple more questions. So firstly, what changes do you want to see to the safeguard? So let's start with you, Grace. When it's up for review, what changes do you want to see?
Thanks, Murray. I think my biggest focus area for the safeguard mechanism at the moment in the data we saw coming out of year one is that 4 of the facilities who had trade exposed baseline adjusted status and had the reduced decline rate of only 1% generated safeguard mechanism credits. And to be clear, to classify for trade exposed baseline adjusted status, you have to prove that in lieu of obtaining that reduced decline rate, you were going to face a pretty significant liability, and that liability was going to have a quite substantial cost to your business. I'm not overly convinced that facilities who receive a reduced decline rate should be able to generate safeguard mechanism credits purely as a result of that reduced decline rate.
That is shocking. I'm amazed. Why? What is the reason for that? Surely, they should be precluded from doing so.
Yeah.
I mean, is that your view?
Yeah, I'd say so. And, it's not a significant number, but it's over 200,000 safeguard mechanism credits combined by those 4 facilities. And I'm not sure it's keeping in sort of the broader policy goals of the scheme.
Yes. No,
that's really interesting. That's really interesting, Grace, because it shows that at 4.9% they were marginal, like it was such an impact, but at 1% it's actually a benefit. So it's so marginal within the 1 to 4.9% decline rate that it impacts them. That's really interesting.
Exactly, yes. And that does, if they receive that status, it's locked in for 3 years. It doesn't go under review. So they now have access to the 1% decline rate each year for 3 years, which realistically, you'd look if they're generating credits in this year. I think there's a reasonable chance they could generate credits in years 2 and 3. And I think it's taking a bit of pressure off those facilities that is not necessarily fair and equal, and comes back to the original principles that the scheme was designed within, that it is fair for all facilities.
I think that's a great pickup. Thanks for that, Franziska.
Well, I know it's only the first year, but I do think that now is the time to look at the current and projected sector-specific impacts of the scheme and ask whether any extra either modifications will be needed in the review year to protect or enhance the safeguard mechanism impact on certain sectors. I mean, I know we don't want to pick necessarily, government might not want to pick winners and losers, but if we're looking at a whole of economy, green transition by 2050, there are going to be winners and losers, and we do need to know what our sector's going to look like our sectors are going to look like, informed by things like the sector decarbonisation pathways and the industries of the future that we want. So I do think either tweaks to the safeguard mechanism that correct for unintended consequences and impacts on some sectors, or like the paper that you mentioned, the report that you mentioned, it argues about complementary policies that should be needed to support and prompt, say, the coal sector to do more in certain states, for example. So that they would be my 2 points. Now is the time to sort of say, watch whether we're steering in the right direction and whether there is unintended consequences. I think if we want, say, a green steel transformation, and we want to be an exporter of green steel potentially in the future, well, we've got to think about that supply chain and the impact on iron ore mining and other metal processing as well, and ask whether we're happy with the impact of the scheme on those sectors in particular.
Thanks for that. And Thomas?
So 2 key things. One is, I think the Australian carbon border adjustment mechanism can't come soon enough. And I know the government's working on that, but I think it's going to be really important to kind of level the playing field here, reduce some of the complexity, as we've just mentioned, around adjustments for those trade exposed industries, and will allow, all parts of the economy to decarbonize. And outside of that, I think, reflecting on the fact that it is a market-based scheme, increased transparency and support around, understanding what the price of carbon is at any one point in time, a little bit more transparency on, how many ACCUs and SMCs have been created and who holds them. Because by doing so, you create increased liquidity and therefore increase the efficiency of the scheme. I do note that there are efforts underway to move in that direction.
Yeah.
But, the sooner they can be realized, the better, I think.
Yeah, I've said that's great. Last question. I'd be interested in a response from each of you. Does having the safeguard mean that all the policy grunt work to reduce emissions among large emitters is done, or are there other policies that we need? So, Franziska, did you want to weigh in first up on that?
No, unfortunately, I don't think all the grunt work is done. Like I said, I think looking at sector-specific implications of the scheme so far and where extra help or correction is needed to make sure we are moving Australia to the the low carbon future that we want, and undertaking energy transition and an economic transition as needed is still definitely needed. I think that's my key point there.
Yep, fair enough. And Grace?
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think we're there yet. I think there's lots of work to be done. There's questions to be asked about broader environmental policy. I think providing extensions to existing fossil fuel extracting companies and facilities, growing the pool of facilities within the safeguard mechanism is not really ideal when we're forcing decarbonisation for those that exist. And there's questions to be asked about the role of fossil fuels in society beyond 2040 if we are to align with science-based decarbonisation pathways globally. So I'd say that's a big area of focus going forward. And really our fossil fuel sectors were the biggest emitters in FY24, as they have been in all previous years under the safeguard mechanism. So whether we need to be treating those facilities differently to make sure we're getting the best outcomes, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Grace, because, I mean, as you said it, I thought, one complementary policy we need to start on is a fossil fuel, phase down and eventual phase out. And we haven't tackled that work at all, even though governments committed, including Australia, committed to it a couple of COPs ago. And in fact, we have a safeguard policy that sort of blithely ignores that task. Thomas, bring us home on this. Do we need any complementary policies?
Really, the safeguard, doesn't do everything that needs to be done. It does really the minimum that needs to be done. So it's a minimum viable product. It's a good minimum viable product, but we certainly need to do more. And really, outside of decarbonising Australia, which we've spoken about extensively today, I think we also, we won't always be able to turn the blind eye to the emissions that are ultimately attributable to activities in Australia that occur outside of Australia. So principally, that is the combustion of all the fossil fuels that we send overseas, which is dramatically more carbon intensive than anything we do domestically, but also the refinement of all the metals, so principally iron ore that we send overseas. So I think very, very soon we need to turn our attention to how do we export, green energy, and that undersea electricity pipeline connection we've got with Singapore, for example, is a really exciting opportunity. But also, how do we do things like manufacture green steel in Australia and export clean iron versus exporting iron ore and coking coal? And I think that we do need to return our attention into those spaces, both to reduce our overall impact, but also to future-proof our economy.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much to you all. That was great.
Thanks so much for having us, Murray. Super interesting.
Thank you, Murray.
Now it's time to talk with Mark Tilley, Asia Pacific editor with Carbon Pulse and Biodiversity Pulse, about the stunning Australian election result, which delivered a massive victory to the Labor Party, and what that victory means for efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions and repair nature. Welcome, Mark Tilley.
Thanks very much, Murray. It's great to be back.
And what an amazing election result. I think completely unexpected, the scale of it. I don't think anybody, certainly not many people, were expecting such a convincing win for Labor and such a thumping for the coalition.
Yeah, I think it took everyone, including Labor itself, by surprise how well they've done. The mandate that they have now is pretty emphatic.
Yes, well, we'll get to that mandate in a minute, but let me just ask you actually how significant you thought climate change and environmental issues more broadly were in this campaign.
The campaign itself was very much focused on cost of living. That said, I think climate is very much on the periphery of the campaign. I mean, there was multiple events that were getting gate crashed by environmental activists, and yeah, obviously some of the policy offerings that on energy were pretty stark, and obviously energy is very much intertwined with climate. So the choice between the government's renewable energy targets and support for new battery subsidies for residential households, and the continuation of the policies that they have rolled out in their first term were not so much part of the campaign debate itself, I don't think, but it was, their track record, I suppose, spoke for themselves, both good and bad. Whereas on the other side, on the coalition, there wasn't really much of a track record to go on, and they were, promising to take us in this very severely different direction by pursuing nuclear energy, and the details around their policies and the, shall we say, overly optimistic timelines at which they thought that they could roll that out, I think played a role in many voters' minds.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, I suppose any sort of nuclear industry people that had sort of flown into Australia maybe 2 years ago to sort of be ready for when the coalition took the reins of government is now quietly packing their bags and heading to the airport. Okay, well, look, let's look forward now. And Labor, I mean, it's hard to imagine that they won't be in office for 6 years. So they've got this 6-year time frame. Let's look at nature first. And, when the Albanese government, at the start of its first term, Tanya Plibersek took on the role of Environment Minister, and Anthony Albanese famously said, Tanya gets things done. And as it turned out, Tanya wasn't allowed to get things done. We did have prime ministerial intervention in a couple of important ways that stymied her ability to resolve some key issues. How do you see these issues playing out over the next few years?
Yeah, well, I think during the campaign, they did promise to legislate national EPA, which was part of those tranche of reforms to the EPPC Act. But there doesn't seem to be much clarity on... sorry, let me rephrase that. They did say that they were going to legislate that, an EPA, but I think Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made a comment that it wouldn't necessarily be the same as it was the first time around they tried to have a go at it in their last term. But we don't really have much clarity on at this stage what those changes would be or how that EPA would be different. I think they're going to face the same tangle of issues that they faced the first time around. On the one hand, they're trying to ensure more protections for the environment and for nature, while at the other side, they're trying to make it simpler and easier for projects to go ahead. And hope potentially the right kind of projects to go ahead, and maybe not so much the wrong ones.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're still going to face, I imagine, this very stiff resistance from industry and mining groups, as well as a very recalcitrant Labor state government in the form of Western Australia. So yeah, it doesn't seem like any of those issues are going to go away. And I mean, perhaps what might be easier for them now is the potential negotiating power they'll have in the Senate, in the sense that they will only have to negotiate with one bloc of major parties in the Senate. So that'll either be the Greens or the Coalition to pass legislation. So they could either work with the Greens to try and hammer out a deal that is more in the environmental protection element's favor, or they could side the coalitions, and it could be the opposite. So it's still unclear, and as I said, those key issues that they faced the first time around, I don't think have been resolved for them. So I think it's going to be another tricky fight.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. And I mean, to some extent, these are global issues, aren't they? That this challenge of how you streamline assessments and approvals for these projects, for the kinds of projects that we desperately need, the renewable energy projects, the critical minerals projects, that kind of thing, transmission, while also protecting nature, reassuring communities that they've got social license, and basically not giving that same ease of access to detrimental projects like fossil fuel projects. I mean, that's the challenge that Australia faces, to come up with a regulatory framework that delivers that. But that will sound very familiar to a lot of other countries, I presume.
Yeah, and it is devilishly complex to get these things right. I think, on the one hand, you have renewable energy groups saying that, you want us to meet these energy transition targets, but our projects are getting caught up in this approval process with a list of actions that we have to adhere to that make it us less competitive, and it's slower to roll out those projects. And on the other side, for the mining side of things, obviously, you have companies who are quite rightly saying we need to develop critical minerals projects for the rollout of, for the requirement of those renewable energy infrastructure projects, as well as things like lithium and cobalt and other minerals of that nature that, to help produce batteries and things of that nature. So on both sides of those issues, there is a need, you would think, to ensure that those kinds of projects are going ahead, and a way to sort of make that easier. But at the same time, obviously, there is, as you say, it has to be done in a way that addresses social license issues, that addresses protecting critical habitat in the context that Australia is rapidly seeing declining outcomes on nature and biodiversity. So, trying to strike that balance is going to be really difficult, and trying to create a framework that sort of addresses all those issues holistically, it's going to be a real challenge.
It is interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, we had the Samuel review of the EPBC Act, and then just, things were looking quite promising, but then they sort of fell to pieces. But in those same 3 years, the New South Wales government just happily and fairly easily steered through major nature reform legislation on a bipartisan basis. We'd overhauled the whole kit and caboodle, as far as I can tell, but how biodiversity credits work, and taking a firmly nature positive approach. And it just seemed to me, well, how come they can do it? And the federal government has found it so hard, and other jurisdictions have found it so hard.
Yeah, I guess. As you say, having bipartisan support for this definitely goes a long way, because that provides the necessary certainty to stakeholders, investors, and the like, that these reforms are going to stick around regardless of who's in government. Whereas, on the federal level, I suppose industry groups and the like can easily engage in lobbying efforts to stop the reforms going ahead at all, given that they know that they have a political party that is on their side. But maybe now that we're looking down, industry's looking down the barrel of 6 years of a Labor government, it might mean they could be more willing to accept that these reforms are coming, and hopefully maybe it'll be a way to sort of get the balance right.
Yes.
I guess there's always, I mean, on that political side, though, there's already concerns, however, that given the large majority that Labor has and, the authority that it has and the scope of the victory that it has, that it could just basically sit on its laurels and not do much of anything, or at least, go about in these reforms in a way that is piecemeal or, doesn't actually address the fundamentals.
I think that's right, isn't it? We will find out very soon just what the appetite for reform really is. Because, this is not a government with these numbers. It's not a government that can say, oh, we'd like to do more, but we're not in a position to do it. So really it will be intriguing to see, I guess, how quickly they move and how far. Now, okay, so let's look out over the next, let's focus, I guess, first up on the next 12 months on the climate and energy front. What are the big ticket items that we should be looking out for with respect to, or at the federal level?
So the biggest one, obviously, is the next nationally determined contribution, which is UN climate speak for our next big emissions reductions target, which is slated for, Australia has to submit that to the UN by September, and it will determine our level of ambition in terms of emissions reductions up to 2035. So draft initial advice from the Climate Change Authority, who is charged with providing advice to the government on emissions reduction targets. Last year, they initially said that a target of reducing emissions by 65 to 75% below 2005 levels by 2035 would be an ambitious but achievable goal. So yeah, that would build off the government's current target of reducing emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. So it really would be a very big signal to investors and policymakers just how big the step change will be in terms of our ambition and the actions and policies that would be needed to meet that 2035 target. So yeah, it's going to be very closely watched. It'll be interesting to see how recent geopolitical events in the US kind of affect the Climate Change Authority's advice, because it's quite famously last year, the Climate Change Authority came out closely after the US election of President Donald Trump, saying, well, his election victory means that we have to go back to our books and analyze how this impacts Australia and Australia's trajectory and Australia's level of ambition that it can achieve now that the US will no longer be part of the Paris Agreement. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that thinking kind of feeds into what their official final advice will be. It's unclear at this stage exactly how soon the Climate Change Authority will be submitting that advice to government and when it will be ready. I think, some people say it could be a matter of weeks. Others say, it could be as late as September. In the meantime, we'll just have to wait and see. But in parallel to that is Australia now, I think, full-throatedly going after the bid to host COP31 in 2026. It featured a little bit during the election campaign where the PM mentioned that he wanted Adelaide to be the host for a potential COP if we were to secure the bid. But yes, right now we're still in the throes of negotiations between ourselves and Turkey, looking to see who gives up what or what can be exchanged for what, so that either ourselves, Australia, or Turkey can withdraw and someone emerges as a victor. I think there's a hope that outcome can be achieved and that bid can be secured during the intersessionals session of the UN, which happens in June.
Anyway, it'll be interesting to see. Hopefully, it will come off. Certainly, there seems to be a lot in Australia's favour in terms of ending up being a co-host of COP31. Let me ask you now about the safeguard. Well, we know now it's going to survive. It will also be reviewed in this term of government, I think, in the coming term of government. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts on what sort of pressures there's likely to be to make changes to it.
Yeah, there's as part of the reforms that the Labor government did in their last term, they scheduled in this review, which is going to be happening in 2026, 2027. And I think an element of that will be, what does the safeguard mechanism look like beyond 2030? So I think it's going to be considered whether international carbon credits will play a role or will be available for emitters to use to meet those baselines. Whether they have a role at all, is probably going to be up for debate. I think there's going to be, some intense lobbying efforts from, the Australian landholder and agricultural sectors, because obviously this whole carbon credit industry works in the favor of private landholders and regional Australian groups that are reaping the windfall of being able to generate and trade and sell carbon credits generated from their own work. And so, they would be I would imagine they would be pretty against the idea of safeguard emitters being able to just go and source them from offshore.
Yes.
On the other side of that, though, there's going to be those large emitters who are, still increasing their emissions by opening up new projects or expanding existing projects that are going to argue that the supply of domestic credits isn't going to be enough to meet their requirements. So and then on the other side, of that again, there will be, I think, an intense effort by some groups who are opposed to these emitters being able to use carbon credits to meet these baselines because of integrity and social license concerns.
Yes.
That I think there will be an attempt there to limit or bar the use entirely of these carbon credits from being able to be used to meet those baselines. So it's going to be an interesting time to see how that works. I mean, there will also be considerations on how the safeguard, how it will interact with emissions leakage policies, things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And that element of how that would work. There'll be a lot of movement in that space during that review.
I mean, it's intriguing. You mentioned the CBAM there, which is like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically is designed to stop domestic emitters that are subject to carbon controls here, from losing out competitively to overseas producers or their overseas competitors who may not be subject to the same level of controls. So there was some important groundwork, very substantial groundwork done on introducing some sort of CBAM in Australia in the previous term of government. Do you expect to see a decision fairly soon on whether Australia is going to go down that path?
Yeah, I think a decision will likely be taken fairly soon. I think Professor Frank Jotso submitted his final, who was running their carbon leakage review last year. I'm pretty sure he submitted his final report to the government, and it's slowly being digested. I think now that the election outcome has been made clear and the Labor's being returned to government, you would expect there to be a decision on that fairly soon. The question of when something, a CBAM or any kind of sort of leakage sort of policy would come into effect, remains to be seen. I imagine there would be it would happen over a sort of a fairly gradual multi-year period. given that, the example we've seen in Europe with their CBAM. But the sooner we have a decision, the sooner that ball can start to begin rolling. So, yeah, I imagine a decision will at least be communicated. This year.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. All right. Look, thanks so much, Mark, for those insights, and we'll look forward to chatting again in the near future. And there is a point that I did want to sort of broadly make, in the sense that as far as I can tell, this is the most stable climate policy platform Australia has had, I think, almost ever, if I'm not mistaken, given that we have this two-term government that is likely to be stepping up on the work that it's done previously. I mean, there are a lot of legitimate arguments to be made about whether Labor last term went far enough in terms of making the safeguard as rigorous as it could, or its environmental law reforms. But yeah, in terms of the progress that they have made so far in terms of the reforms to the safeguard, and the fact that the safeguard is going to continue and continue to send those investment signals for emitters to step up in terms of decarbonisation, but then also other things as well. So the development of offshore wind zones, the new vehicle efficiency standards, which is going to drive the uptake of electric vehicles in Australia, and that's important too, because after electricity, transport is going to become Australia's most polluting source of emissions. And so yeah, I think there are the foundational groundwork, I think, has been laid, and the fact that it's not going to be all unwound or torn down or veer off into this completely different direction that could have been the case otherwise is it seems like a big game changer in the broad narrative of Australia's efforts to tackle emissions. And the stage is Labor's now, I suppose, to see if they can actually pull it off. Oh, that's not even to mention all the future made in Australia stuff. Yes, yeah.
It's going to be exciting to see whether they can actually, pull it off.
That's a really good, strong point. We do finally have some continuity, which has been in short supply, very short supply for so many years. It's
decades even.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and it's such a big relief. Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate it, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Always a pleasure, Murray. Cheers.
That's it for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed my chats with that awesome foursome of Grace, Thomas, Franziska, and Mark. If you did, please rate the show on your favourite podcast platform and tell your colleagues about it. If you want to provide feedback or suggest some episode themes, you can reach me on murray@earthed.au. Track Changes is a labour of love at the moment, so please also reach out if you want to talk about sponsoring a few episodes. See you next time.